10:45. The tavern was the biggest place around, and was perched on the highest point. Built entirely of stone, it seemed a fortress, a castle at the crossroads, with sparkling glass windows and a high, peaked roof. To the south, 7 miles, was Pennington. 20 miles distant was Trenton town. The British and the hated Hessians held them both. 10 miles to the northwest lay Alexandria. Fleming was 6 miles north by east, and to the west, hugging the big river, lay Wells Ferry. Americans held those towns. Jonathan had been to none of them, American or British held. As he approached the tavern, Jonathan could see the bell. A friend, a boy his own age, was heaving the cord. The bell hung in its own rack, set up to sound alarms. It stood to one side of the green where the men practiced for militia duty, an exercise that Jonathan dearly loved to watch. Some men had already gathered at the tavern and were busy talking. Becoming shy, Jonathan slowed his pace. As he approached, a man climbed a tree to watch the roads. Jonathan wished someone would tell him what was happening, but no one paid him mind. He thought, "They don't know I've come to fight." "Here comes someone," cried the man in the tree. "Got his gun? Looks it." Cartridge pouches, powder horns, and guns had been left against the tavern. Jonathan wished he'd brought his father's gun. He felt a tap on his shoulder. "Your father coming?" was the question. Before he could reply, someone else said, "His leg's still sitting poor." They paid no more mind to Jonathan. Frustrated, he went over to the bell. Though he would rather have spoken to the men, he talked to his young friend. "What's going?" he asked. "Soldiers," said his friend, fitting the word between strokes of the bell. A whip of excitement cut through Jonathan. "Enemy ones?" he asked. "That's what they say," his friend replied. 11 o'clock. As Jonathan watched, a man came out of the tavern, someone he had never seen before. He was a large man with broad shoulders and a red, badly pock-marked face. His shirt, spilling out of his trousers, wasn't very clean, and his dark green jacket with fraying cuffs was clearly old. His boots were caked with mud. His hat was too small. When the man came out of the tavern, he was holding a tankard with one hand, wiping crumbs from his mouth with the other. He stood in front of the tavern door, surveying the gathered men who in turn kept keen eyes on him. "Any more coming?" the stranger called. "Be some time yet," came the reply. "We don't have time," the stranger snapped. He took a half-step around as if to go back inside. The tavern keeper stood in the doorway. "By God," the stranger said, "don't they understand? If we don't move, they'll get through." The tavern keeper said nothing at all. A man came running, cresting the hill. A gun was in his hand. "Where are they coming from?" he called. "Pennington way," called one of the men. "How many? 15 or less? Who saw them? The corporal's come." Again heads turned to the stranger. He was finishing off his drink. When done, he handed the tankard to the keeper, who took it silently. "Here's more," cried the man in the tree. "You be patient, corporal," he called to the stranger. "You'll have an army yet." The tavern keeper shook his head. "It's groundbreaking time." The corporal strode down from the doorway and approached the men. "How long will it take marching troops to get here from Linvale?" he asked. "That's 4 miles, came an answer. "An hour and a half, was the calculation. Impatiently, the stranger rubbed his hands together, then suddenly swung around to face the bell where Jonathan was standing, watching. "That's enough," the corporal barked to Jonathan's friend. "They'll either come or not." The boy let the rope drop. Again the stranger considered the group of men, then, turning, discovered Jonathan's eyes fixed on him. "You handle a gun?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Jonathan managed to get out. "And you?" the stranger asked the other boy. The boy shook his head, no. The corporal glowered, then shifted around once more and drifted toward the men. 4 more had run in, making 13 in all. The corporal appraised them, then turned to the tavern keeper. "You coming?" he asked. "We'll need to have ourselves a second line in case they get through," said the innkeeper. "I'd best stick here." The corporal frowned, and then, lost in thought, went to his horse and tightened up the saddle. Only then did it occur to Jonathan that this corporal, whoever he was, had ridden in with the news. He wondered where he had come from and just what he had seen and why he'd come to this place. When he finished fussing with his horse, the corporal swung around to face the waiting men. "There's no more time," he said. "We need to go." Jonathan noticed that the men were now watching one another as much as they watched the stranger. "Aren't we going to wait for more?" came the question. "It's late," the corporal replied. "Yes or no, are we going?" No one spoke. Then someone, Jonathan didn't see who, gave a murmur. Others took it up, a brief swelling sound, not quite a word. "All right," the corporal said, choosing to take the sound as yes. He looked about again, his eyes coming to rest on Jonathan. "You," he said, pointing. "You said you could shoot. Get a musket from the tavern. You're needed." 11:30. His pride soaring, Jonathan grinned at his friend, who was looking at him with astonishment. Then Jonathan turned toward the tavern keeper, who was standing by the door. "Going, are you?" the tavern keeper said before Jonathan could speak. "Yes, sir." "Got asked special, did you?" Jonathan nodded yes. "What's your father to say?" "Told me to come." "Did he?" Jonathan didn't say. "And now," said the tavern keeper, "our blessed corporal asks to borrow a gun." "I can use it." "Hope you can," said the tavern keeper. He moved inside, saying, "Come on." Jonathan bounded up the steps. It was dark inside. The wooden floorboards, shiny from heavy use, glowed with a dark brown warmth. The rank smell of ale and cider thickened the air. Waiting just inside the door, Jonathan kept his eyes on the far end of the large, dim room, where the white glow of the keeper's shirt moved behind the grill. Within moments, the man emerged from the dark, a gun in his hand. It was a flintlock musket, almost 6 feet long, butt and stock of polished wood. Jonathan saw that it was older than his father's gun, but to him it was nothing less than beautiful. Reaching out with one hand, he put his fingers around the cold metal barrel. It was unexpectedly heavy. He had to thrust out his other hand to keep it up. Holding it tightly, he brought the gun close to his chest, then let it swing down till the butt rested on the floor. The gun reached above his head. "Manage?" the tavern keeper asked. "Yes, sir," said Jonathan. "Sure, I can. It's 12 pounds of weight." Jonathan studied the gun from its topmost ramrod to its shiny hammerlock to its bottom butt plate. Knowing the gun was his to use, he felt a deep glow inside. "Have I got your word of honor you'll bring it back?" "Yes, sir." "Your honor as a man?" "Yes, sir." The tavern keeper strung a cartridge pouch around the boy's neck. 30 cartridges, he said. "Wrapped them myself. Here's your powder." He added the powder horn. "Any extra flint?" Jonathan asked, wanting to show he understood what he was about. "What I've got to spare is on the gun." The tavern keeper kept studying Jonathan, measuring him. "Look here," he finally said. "You don't have to go. You can leave all this and get on out through the back. No one's going to know or care. Not that man. Just because he's tapped you doesn't mean you have to go. He likes telling folks what to do." Jonathan, not even wanting to hear the words, looked down. He fingered the gun nervously. "You know much about him?" the tavern keeper asked. Jonathan shook his head no. The tavern keeper considered. Then he sighed. "Here, take care of yourself," he said. For a moment Jonathan remained standing there, not knowing what to say. "Get on then if you're going," the man said with a wave of his hand. "Get." Jonathan turned, inadvertently smashing the gun butt against the doorframe. The shock made him almost drop the gun. Recovering, he hastened outside into the light. The men had already begun to move south along the Pennington Road. The corporal, astride his horse, was rounding past the bend. Jonathan looked about. Behind him, from the building's darkness, the tavern keeper watched, while in front his friend sat on the bell rack frame, hands to either side. He too was watching. Grasping the gun tightly in both hands, Jonathan jumped down the steps and ran down the road toward Pennington. 12:05. The gun was heavy. Jonathan tried throwing it over his shoulder and resting it as the others did, only to find its weight cut into his neck. He had to use both hands and carry it across his chest. He didn't like the notion that he was the only one who held his gun that way. Still, he had no choice. There were the cartridge box and powder horn, too. They kept thumping against his legs, the straps having been cut for a tall man. When they clattered over the first wooden bridge south of the crossroads, Jonathan was still far behind. A little farther on came another bridge. He saw the corporal had called a stop before they crossed it, and from his horse he was talking to the men. Hurrying, Jonathan ran to catch up, but missed the first part of what had been said. "At least that's my figuring," he heard the corporal say. "It couldn't be helped. But we can stop them if we've stomach enough. They won't think we'll try." "How many do you think there'll be?" called a man. Jonathan, on the outer fringe of the group, strained to listen, glad to be able to rest his gun on the ground. 20, 25, came the corporal's offhanded reply. His words were met with uneasy silence. Jonathan, sensing that something was wrong, looked around. "Before you said that they weren't more than 15, came an angry voice. "Did I?" said the corporal coolly. "Then I misspoke myself." Again, save for the shifting feet of the men, there was a silence. Jonathan noticed how nervous they were. It hadn't occurred to him that they would be. "Does 5 more turn you about?" the corporal asked. Jonathan looked from face to face, waiting for a reply. He saw downcast eyes, furtive and unsure. Then someone said, "I want to hear again what brought them out. You said a committee of public safety. Aside from yourself, how many were there?" The corporal's face turned redder. "Ask them," he snapped. "Here," came a tense voice. "We didn't elect you, Corporal. Sitting on a horse don't make you so damn high." "You can choose for yourself," came the return, and angrily the corporal swung down from his horse. "I just beg you gentlemen to make it fast. While you're holding your Congress, they're coming closer. Who will you have?" Jonathan watched the shifting eyes. No one said a word. No one looked directly at the corporal. "Then, by God," the corporal snapped, "I'll be your man. Is that your silent meaning?" Jonathan, trying to understand what was happening, saw the men shift about. No one spoke a word. They seemed cowed. Quickly, the corporal remounted. "Come on, then," he said. "We need to get to Rocktown before they do. We can ambush them from the trees, if that's your pleasure." The notion of an ambush, rather than an open fight, cheered the men. Jonathan saw the tension ease. A few men grinned. Turning his horse, the corporal moved on toward the bridge. The men followed briskly. Jonathan gathered up his gun and hurried after. For himself, he was glad the corporal led them. He thought him a strong, forceful man.
Made it to 0.
What do you mean?
I was about to go to the other